Welcome to my coding school. So let's continue with the CSS Grid layout. So in the last video, we were looking at the grid flow properties. We said that the grid auto flow controls how auto place items get inserted into the grid. So the default is row. So here in our code, if we simply set the display grid and then we leave the rest of the properties unset, by default, this is what we shall have. We shall have multiple rows for the items. But then if we start setting this to row, then we shall have these rows. But then if I set it to columns, to rows, I mean columns, save, we now have different columns, and they will be stretching from top to bottom. So here, I'll comment out this, and then save. Then we shall have the columns with their width, and then I use the rows now, then save. Fix this. Save. Come to the browser, and then we should have this kind of setup. And then I did talk about other two properties called grid template area and then the grid, which I'm not going to cover. You can make a brief research on them to see how they work. So now let's get to grid items properties. So grid column start and then grid column start control on which column line the items start. So it can be on the start or on the end. So the grid column is a shorthand for both properties. I will come here in the code and then I'll comment up this, and then I'll bring up our rows and columns here. Save. Then we are back. Then I'll also remove the height. Then we shall have this. And then what I'll do is I'll come just below the items. Now we are working on items, so I'll come to item 1, and then I'll set grid column start here. Then it can be at the start. Let's look at the properties. So it can be at the start or at the end. So here I'll set start and then grid column end. And then here I'll specify where it will end. Save. And then this is what we shall have. So here we need a little bit of correction. This one doesn't take these values, and this simply takes the 1. Then we shall start at line 1, and then here we shall end at line 3. So if I go into the browser and then save, you'll see that this one, it will start here and then it will end at line 3. So it is taken now to columns. So if I'm not sure where it should end, I can simply use the span and then set them to save, and then it shall span on the 2 columns. By adding 3, it should span the whole of the columns, and then item 2 will start at this row, and then the rest of the setup will continue. So the shorthand is called a grid column. So now let's go to grid start row and then grid row start and then grid row end, which control on which row lines the items start or end. So here, instead of columns, I'll use here a row. Then here we'll use also a row. Then save, and then you'll start at this row, then end at the third row, because here we specified row 3. It can be row 2, and then it will only span 2 rows. And then if we move on to the next thing, note that we can specify both rows and columns start and end like this. So we can use the grid row, and then we use this value. And then for the grid column, we can also set it like this, both the start and the end. You only need to separate them using /. So the next set of item properties is called justify self, align self, and then place self. So justify is for the row, and then align self for the column, and then this one is for both. So let's work with this. So here I'll still use this very one. I'll use justify self, and then we have the start, save, come to the browser, and then it will be at the start but along this row. If I set it to end, we get it at the end. So now you can also practice with other properties, and then we have align self. So if it set to end, we shall now have it at the end of the column, and then start, it will be at the start of the column. And then we have place self, and then if I set it as start, they will both be a start but in that corner, both along the row and then the column. So this is it for the Flexbox. And get more examples online, and then you practice, and then you'll be ready to design complex layouts.